Hey there, and welcome back to my channel. My name's Caleb, and today what I'm going to do is finish up the little Skinner that we started in part one. We're going to do a quick recap of that real quick. If you haven't seen that, I will link that above so you can take a look at it. But all we did was forge the blade and get that ready for heat treat, and eventually get it heat treated in the end of part one. So after some quick profiling, getting it heat treated and tempered, we're going to pick up here with doing the bevels. I'm using a drastically worn out 36 grit belt to get the edge kind of brought down. It is forged mostly to shape, so it's got very, very minimal grinding. All I really did was just convex the edge down to a point. I used a 36 grit, a 150 grit, and then a 400 grit, all completely worn belts before hand sanding. It's worth mentioning too here, when you're grinding post heat treat, make sure you keep that blade cool. You will ruin your temper and end up having to heat treat again. All right, so now it's time to hand sand. I generally start out one grit below what I ended with on the belt. So I ended with a 400 grit belt. So I started with 320 grit paper and worked it all the way up through to 1000 grit and then buffed it. It's worth mentioning too that I do skip a few grits. So in other words, I go from 320 to 400, 600, 800, 1000. I have skipped 800 before if I didn't have any paper on hand, but it's a little easier to get the 600 grit scratches out if you do go to 800. And then after that, I hit it on the buffer pretty quick, and it came out great. So I chose Cocobolo for the handle material. I've never used it before. It's a pretty oily wood, but it doesn't require stabilization, so I figured it would be a good chance to try that out, especially on a knife that I feel like will probably be used quite a bit. So what I did was I squared that up off camera, took it out, and drilled the holes. Something worth mentioning here, whenever you're drilling your pinholes, it is probably one of the most unmentioned things that I've ever seen, especially as far as videos goes. But it makes a world of difference to have your plate squared up to your work table squared up to your drill bit. If you try to drill these holes without everything being square, it is next to impossible to get things to line up. And I'm using probably the cheapest Harbor Freight drill press that you can get. In just a few minutes, getting everything squared up and squared away, and don't press too hard to make the table flex. Everything will fit right together the first time. So now I'm going to go through and get the blade tangs traced out on the scales so I can take those out and get them cut out. A little less grinding in the long run. It makes for a little bit quicker handle shaping. Once you get everything glued up, you don't have to go through and grind through all the mess on the sides that's already cut off. Don't forget to always label which side goes where. There's nothing worse than getting everything cut out and realizing you've got two of the same side. Now this thing has bit me before. Be super careful whenever you're messing with a bandsaw, especially one that's not really meant to be used this way. I do have it mounted up in a table, and it's worked fine. But I have been cutting G10 before, and it jumped and got me pretty good. So make sure you're using extra caution whenever using these things, because there's no forgiveness when it comes down to it. Now this is the part that gets forgot about quite a bit. Can't tell you how many people have called me after glue up on a knife and realized that they forgot to fix this, and there's no really way to fix it that I know of without messing your blade up. I've seen people fix it with files and whatnot, but always finish the front of your scales prior to glue up. Make sure that part is completely finished and ready to go before you ever glue the knife up. I generally will take mine down to about 400 grit, then I'll bevel them, and then take that bevel down to 400 grit as well. Now, as far as getting that where it needs to be, I do just eyeball it. I don't scribe a line or anything to get the edge, down to the base. I generally will just eyeball that and make sure that they're both very close to the same, and it looks good. If I found that if it's pleasing to the eye, generally speaking, it's close enough. Now it's time for the dreaded glue up. This is probably my least favorite part of any kind of knife making, mainly just because I always make a mess. I've gotten better at it over the last couple of years of learning and watching and seeing other people do it, but it still seems to be that it's one of those things that I still tend to make a mess. So right here I'm cleaning the blade off and getting it ready to blue. I wasn't sure if I was going to leave this one polished or if I was going to gun blue it, and in the end I decided to go ahead and gun blue it. I think it looks good. It came out very rustic, and the polished, the steel blued looks really well. I always clean everything off with acetone. I've made that mistake before and things didn't stick well. It's such a small step, but if you clean everything off good before you put that epoxy on there, it will be solid, and you will catch hell trying to get it off if you ever need to. Clean up that epoxy at the front of the scales good, because once that's there, it's there, and that's another thing that can't be fixed very easily later or at all. And now this is probably my favorite part of knife making, which is shaping the handle. It's when you can kind of bring the knife to life. They say that a knife becomes a knife whenever it's heat treated, and I believe that. But at the end of the day, you can't you can't really hold on to anything well without a handle. So once this handle gets contoured is kind of when a knife becomes a knife in my mind. So what I'm doing now is just going through and flattening everything out, and then I'll start contouring it and shaping it. Basically all I do is I'll bring the corners down to 45s. and then I'll start rounding those over. And then once I get a good solid shape with my 36 grit, I'll put a 220J flex on it and use the slack part to kind of clean up and round everything over, and then I'll hand sand it up to about 1,000 grit. Make sure whenever you're using this flex belt to get all the 36 grit scratches out, or else you'll catch hell trying to get them out later with hand sanding. I've had a lot of trouble trying to get those out just with hand sanding. I probably need to get a knife vise or something to hold my knife a little bit better when I am hand sanding, but as of right now I just hold it. But once I get all the 36 grit scratches out with this belt, hand sanding is pretty easy. And I always use the Dremel tool to kind of touch up the underside. I do have the small wheel attachments, and I'm just not super comfortable with them yet, but I am with a Dremel, so I end up using the Dremel quite a bit just to clean up the underside of the tang. And here it is rough shaped out. It's a little dark in my shop, so it's hard to see. But what I did off camera was I took it and I ended up hand sanding it up to about 600 grit, and then I buffed it. And then I used gun blue around the edges to make sure everything was blacked out once it was all said and done. So this is about a 3-ish inch hand forged 1084 Skinner with Cocobolo handles and brass pins. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't. Thanks.